3 weeks after the start of the latest process to bring peace to Syria, and there's little change. The latest round of talks ended on Saturday after days of accusation and counter-accusation. And in Syria, the death toll rises. A disappointed chief negotiator, Lakhdar Brahimi, said he had instructed all involved to reflect on their negotiating positions.
I have suggested that it's not good for the process, it's not good for Syria, that we come back for another round and fall in the same traps that we have been struggling with this week and most of the first round.
So is there any room for continued negotiation? The Western-backed Syrian National Coalition maintains the only way forward is immediate talks on a transitional government. The Syrian government argues the main priority is fighting terrorism. The intervention of senior diplomats from Russia and the US did not break that deadlock. Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor James Bays has been following events in Geneva.
We've now had 2 rounds of these negotiations in Geneva. They've been meeting around the same table on some days, but they've achieved absolutely nothing. What's clear is that the 2 sides are divided even on the agenda. We know that the government mainly want to speak about stopping violence and what they call terrorism in Syria. They would like that to be the first agenda item, and they'd like to discuss that, and until that item has been resolved, they don't want to talk about anything else. The opposition say that there must be discussion about the transitional governing body, which under the Geneva Communiqué of 2012 is supposed to run Syria in the future. Dr. Brahimi, we now know, proposed that perhaps they should talk about fighting terrorism and ending the violence on the first day, and then move to the other subject of that governing body on the second day, to come back to both those subjects at a later date. And that's what he's also proposed for the 3rd round of these talks. But he has made it quite clear that the Syrian government side are not accepting that compromise he's put forward. He seems to have problems too, because Russia and the US, which are the co-sponsors of this process, they came up with the idea of these talks. They too are trading barbs. It means that Dr. Brahimi has got to go away and think now how he can revive this process. We understand he'll be travelling to New York in the next week or so to see the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, but also, and more importantly perhaps, to meet the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They include the US and Russia, and I think their role will be crucial if there is to be a 3rd round of these talks. This is James Bays for Inside Syria at the United Nations in Geneva.
So what hope is there for another round, and is there an alternative approach? To discuss this, we're joined by our 3 guests. From Moscow, we have journalist and political analyst Pavel Felgenhauer. From Washington, Professor Richard Rubinstein, a political scientist and expert in conflict resolution at George Mason University. And here in Doha, Professor Mahjoub Zoueri, a Middle East analyst at Qatar University. Pavel Felgenhauer, I assume the Russian position is the same as the Syrian government's. What is so objectionable about speaking about violence on day 1 of any future talks and a transitional government on day 2?
Moscow basically supports the Al-Assad regime and does not see any advantage in moving forward on the transitional quote-unquote government while there's the so-called terrorist active in Syria. Russia's strategy has been, and it is now is the same, to try and kind of insert more splits within the already rather fragmented Syrian opposition, find different, more moderate, quote-unquote, fractions that maybe will be ready to form some coalition with the Al-Assad people against the more hardline jihadist Salafist fighters. And that this is a kind of arrangement that could ensure that the Al-Assad regime continues in power. So right now, when the talks in Geneva are deadlocked, Russia is going to blame the intransigence of the opposition, blame the West for supporting that intransigence, and that's more or less the story.
So is that because then Russia simply doesn't
Russia is not right now...
doesn't think that there is any credible interlocutor in these talks on the part of the opposition right now, and that their only strategy then is to divide the opposition until there is a credible interlocutor?
Well, there's been for some time Moscow's trying to put out some feelers to the opposition, hoping that more moderate fractions are so much right now in confrontation with more radical Islamists that they will see the reason to move closer to al-Assad. This has been Russian strategy to find such kind of solution, because basically Moscow is being, for all these years of the Syrian conflict, looking for ways to somehow keep al-Assad in power and deal with the violence by maybe incorporating part of the opposition. That's what we have been telling to al-Assad.
But
we of course support him, but
there was movement, though, at these talks with the opposition presenting a 24-point plan on not just ending the violence and expelling foreign fighters, but also not mentioning Assad and talking about keeping established government institutions intact, not purging the government a la Iraq and so on. Surely that was a sign then that Russia should have encouraged instead of simply dismissing.
Here Russia is going to be looking more, I mean, our influence and possibility of pressure on the al-Assad regime is limited, and also actually we not always want to exert the pressure even if we have some leverage. We will be leaving that to some extent to the al-Assad people for them to decide how they're going to deal with it, because our end result in Moscow's view is allowing the al-Assad people to cling to political power in Damascus in some kind of form.
So that's the view from one of the sponsors of this peace conference. Professor Swery, what about the viewpoint then of the other sponsor, the US and its allies? What do they want from further talks?
I think the United States is trying to tackle what's so-called the hegemony of Russia now. They try to make sure that Russia movement is controlled as much as they can. The United States and its regional allies, they try to make sure that there is a very clear roadmap towards the solution. The United States has no interest to see al-Assad in power. The United States and its allies, they don't see that the problem is only terrorism. They see the terrorism also from the government side. So basically they have different view on the conflict on the ground. And I think that view is complicating the whole issue, and which took the negotiation to this kind of deadlock. The third point, I see it from the United States perspective and its allies, basically concerning the opposition. They are not sure yet that the opposition can work together, can replace the government and
that seems to be a concern of Moscow too. That's why they try to whittle it down.
Yeah, they share with Moscow the same concern. However, they don't share with Moscow that this point is a crisis. The United States believes that they can work on solving it and pushing most of the players to work together as they did before to bring them to Geneva.
But you do think they want peace? I mean, there's always a suggestion that, as far as the US is concerned, a quagmire, a murderous quagmire, a long stalemate is pretty okay for their geostrategic interests because it keeps so many of their enemies busy.
But yeah, that's correct. But also the United States has more interest on other file, which actually the United States is working on, which is Iran's file. Basically, the United States, the perspective from Washington that there are two files on the table. Iran's negotiation on long-term deal in Geneva and Syria issue. So they want to make sure that those two regimes, they cannot get together again. So basically the focus now on Iran maybe more than in Syria, because they see that the Syrian situation is more complicated. If they can get something from Iran, the situation in Syria can be solved later on. They want to weaken one of those two players in the region as much as they can. I think this is what makes the United States less influential on the negotiation regarding Syria, which basically means that the United States' priority, if you look at regional, I would say, atmosphere, is actually getting a deal with Iran first, and then trying to weaken the Syrian regime at the second stage.
Professor Rubinstein, then, that's analysis of the two sponsors of this peace conference's motivation. The question then is always, what hope for Syria itself and for the Syrian people? In the past, you've written that conflict resolution professionals are familiar with the glib pessimism of commentators and others that always envelop peace talks. Help us understand why we shouldn't fall victim to that sort of pessimism now.
Well, I think the problem really is the incompatibility in some ways between traditional diplomacy and conflict resolution. In your show so far, people who have been talking about issues of power, issues of sponsorship or co-sponsorship of the talks, issues of whether we're dealing with terrorism or not, issues of what a transitional government should look like, and none of those issues have very much to do with what this conflict is really about. It's a civil war. It has causes in Syria. There have been, there are serious issues, obviously, dividing the Assad regime from its opposition, and dividing elements of the opposition from each other. And those issues are not being talked about by us right now, and they're not being talked about in Geneva. So it seems to me that we need to refocus, and I hope that Brahimi's advice to rethink what's going on in Geneva, that both parties should rethink. I hope he does some rethinking as well, because the question is, how are you going to deal with three sets of interrelated issues? How are you going to deal with the humanitarian crisis, which is absolutely ghastly and which is taking lives every day? How are you going to deal with the fact that in many ways the Syrian conflict is a proxy war, that it involves the Iranians, it involves the Saudis, it involves the Russians, it involves the Americans? And most important, how are you going to deal with what were originally the causes of the conflict in Syria?
Right.
Which involve underlying issues. What
we're going to need from you, Professor Rubinstein, in the next, in as short a way as possible, in a concise way as possible, is give us that roadmap. And first of all, is there any precedent for separating out such a complex war into its component parts and then solving it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one very strong precedent is Northern Ireland, which I've talked to George Mitchell, who did the Northern Ireland mediation, about it, and he agreed that a key to solving the Northern Ireland problem was getting the great powers, getting the British and getting the Southern Irish to withdraw sufficiently to allow the parties themselves to deal with the issues that most seriously divided them.
Right. But Northern Ireland isn't Syria geostrategically, is it?
No, of course not. Every situation is different, but the principle, it seems to me, the basic procedural principle is the same. The Syrian people have a right to decide what kind of country they want to live in. Facilitators ought to facilitate what I would call social constitutional dialogue between elements of the Syrian population, and not necessarily people elected or officially appointed on either side. These dialogues are very effective when they take place with people who represent their communities but who are not holding seats of power and don't have to answer immediately to constituents and are not in the glare of publicity.
All right.
In fact, Harold Saunders, who did this kind of a mediation in Eastern Europe, was a real pro, and still is, at doing this kind of social constitutional dialogue. So that is one of the things that needs to be done.
Pavel
The Syrian
Felgenhauer,
people have got to be...
Can you see any prospect then for the different international actors who are involved in this conflict because of its huge geostrategic importance to get out of the way and actually make this about Syrian self-determination?
Well, now it seems at present everything is deadlocked. Attempts by foreign powers, and Geneva was, of course, an attempt by outside powers to insert some kind of reason and maybe a bit of peace and at least to make the sides talk in Syria. Well, it doesn't seem to work out that well. That means it's most likely going to continue. It's not if the talks are deadlocked, then the violence continues. From the Moscow point of view, there's we see that the situation may be moving in the right direction, meaning that more outsiders and people in the West and politicians understand the nature of the Syrian conflict, that there are al-Qaeda connected bad guys active there, and this will may decrease the support for the opposition, and maybe in the West, people, powers and politicians would understand the Russian point of view that Assad is not that bad compared to what he may be replaced with if he falls. And this, I mean, Russia's policy on Syria is rather focused to find ways this way or that way or the other way, but to kind of allow Assad to wiggle out of the hole he is right now, and keep the status quo, or at least some kind of semblance of the status quo. And we're trying to muster support for such a position from different quarters.
As the stalemate continues, the fighting has intensified. More than 5,000 people have been killed since the second round of talks began in Geneva. Most fighting is centered around Aleppo, where the government's barrel bomb campaign continues. There's also been government shelling in the city of Daraa, that's just north of Syria's border with Jordan. The government siege of Homs continues despite relief efforts there. Opposition positions still being targeted in the city. And the United Nations says it fears the Syrian army is planning a major ground assault along the Lebanese border, mainly in the town of Yabrud. More than 2,500 people have fled the fighting there in the past few days, many crossing the border to the town of Arsal in neighboring Lebanon. This is exacerbating the already intense refugee crisis for the Lebanese. The only success of the peace process has been the evacuation of the besieged city of Homs. A spasmodic ceasefire has enabled 1,400 people to leave the besieged city, but hundreds still remain. Professor Zouairi, though, I mean, even Homs, though, when you talk to people, those who favour Lakhdar Brahimi's peace process will look at this as a great success. At least there was this bit of hope. Those who don't favour the peace process say, you see, this was actually simply a bit of a distraction. In fact, the regime was escalating fighting elsewhere. In fact, the opposition was escalating fighting in the south of Damascus, and there was an influx of Saudi weaponry during the peace talks. So how should we look at this then? Is the peace process serving as a distraction in some ways?
If you allow me, Shab, just to go back to some of the views from Washington. What happened in Syria, the roots of it, it's not a civil war. This is the a demand by Syrian people, peacefully. People, they went outside. They call for change. The reaction from the government was using violence. So this is, if you're going to the root of that. So basically, international community, the absence of international will of solving the problem in the first 6 months took the problem to that level of violence, because the absence of the United States, the determination of Russia to maintain the regime as it is now without any change of the first year, that took us to that stage where basically now everyone blame the others, whether the fact is, like other nations, Syria, they call for change. If I want to go back to your question, all of what happened in the last few weeks, of course, each part will call it as a success. Of course, the government will say, okay, we gave a concession, we changed, we allow people to leave Homs. The opposition, they will say also they help. But at the end of the day, violence continued. The number of people, the number of casualties has increased rapidly. And I don't think so. None of the players actually had contributed positively to that. Basically, because none of them played a role by their own will. It was by pressure from outside, and that was the crisis. That was the problem, because basically none of those players, they take into consideration the suffering of Syrian people on the ground. I think which is the core of those conflicts so far.
Right, but Professor Rubinstein, though, how do we interpret the escalation of the conflict during peace talks? Is that simply textbook stuff, creating facts on the ground? Is that a sign perhaps that people think there is a resolution coming, or is it a sign that negotiations are being conducted in bad faith and should be abandoned?
Well, no. Escalation of conflict during peace talks is very common. As each side tries, in fact, escalation can sometimes intensify the closer you get to an actual peace. But, you know, this is a civil war. I'm sorry, with due respect to my friend, it's not just a mass revolution against a handful of people. It's a civil war. And the talks, the point is, I think, that the talks should continue, not the formal talks that Brahimi has been trying to facilitate, but the kinds of talks that we call second-track diplomacy, or even third-track diplomacy, talks between key leaders in Syria.
All right, but who organizes those, Professor Rubinstein?
Well, Brahimi could do it himself. You know, unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't have very good facilities at the moment for conflict resolution. They have good diplomacy facilities, but not very good conflict resolution facilities. There are many people who would be capable of facilitating these kinds of talks. Jimmy Carter has a list of about 1,500 people who could help facilitate, and I can even name some of them, who could help facilitate these talks. And rather than get despairing now and say, well, the talks have broken down, everybody should, you know, wait until there might be a third round, the talks should go ahead right now.
Right, but they're
There's
not.
no reason why.
And I think Pavel has laid out an analysis of the Russian position. The US position, some argue, is rather similar, though, that perhaps a prolonged stalemate is in the best interest geopolitically as part of the proxy war. But it's too soon for peace, perhaps.
Well, as long as the great powers duel with each other over issues of power, you're not going to have peace. There has to be a switch from the power-based diplomacy to an issues-based dialogue, what I called social constitutional dialogue between the actual parties in Syria. And there's no reason why that couldn't start tomorrow. And I'll tell you something else. There are people on both sides who will be interested in participating in those.
Right, but John Kerry,
in that kind of dialogue,
hasn't suggested that. He started suggesting that maybe the US was beginning to consider a military option again.
Yes, that would be a great pity, but you know, you're talking about people, I'm sorry to say, who in some ways are tone deaf. All they hear is power. All they speak is the language of power. So that the issue of basic human needs, which needs to be addressed first and foremost by the Syrians themselves, never gets on the table because everybody's too busy dueling about the issues of power. That sort of shift has taken place in certain key conflicts before, and it can take place again.
Presumably, Pavel Felgenhauer, though, the Russians wary of any humanitarian resolution at the UN Security Council, because in the past the US, I guess in Libya is the most recent example, have used humanitarian resolutions as a pretext for military action. But what about any other constructive UN Security Council resolution, perhaps an arms embargo on behalf to stop all sides, the Russians, the Americans, the Saudis, everyone, the Iranians, stopping feeding this conflict? I guess, wouldn't that be perhaps a more practical way of going about conflict resolution right now in the short term, if that's what they want?
Well, as far as I know, Moscow will be absolutely opposed to any kind of arms embargo, and believing that since the opposition is getting its arms from under kind of unofficially through unofficial channels and closing Russian official channels to give arms and munitions to the Syrian government forces would be totally inappropriate. So no, this was not, I don't think that this is going to have any kind of positive response from Russia. And as I see it right now, Washington is mostly right now concerned that the Al-Assad regime may be dragging its feet on chemical weapons. That's most likely more important for Washington than the Geneva II talks per se. And that's why right now maybe in Washington they're beginning to talk about maybe putting even military pressure or threat of military pressure on Damascus. That's also concerned first and foremost with the chemical weapons issue. So Washington will be looking to Moscow to put some pressure on the al-Assad to finalize the decommissioning of the chemical weapons.
Pavel Felgenhauer, thank you very much. Professor Richard Rubenstein, thank you. Professor Mahjoub Zweri, thank you as well. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria.